Imagine a company, right, whose work might be touching, maybe even shaping the health of like a billion people, but at the same time, they're wrestling with fierce competition, unexpected market stuff. That's kind of the fascinating world Novo Nordisk lives in. It's the story of huge growth, but also this strategic, well, tug of war.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into Novo Nordisk's half-year financial report. First 6 months of 2025 dropped August 6th. Our goal, go beyond just the big numbers. We want to unpack what's really going on. Their finances, sure, but also what's driving sales, their R&D pipeline, which is pretty ambitious, and how they're handling big things like sustainability, leadership changes. So yeah, let's dive straight in. Looking at the overall financial snapshot, what jumps out at you first?
Well, the headline numbers are, they're more than just strong. They really paint a picture of a company just dominating its field, especially if you look at constant exchange rates, right? That gives a clearer view of the actual business performance. So for H1 2025, sales jumped 16% in Danish kroner, even better, 18% at constant exchange rates or CER. That's DKK 154.9 billion.
Okay, big number.
Yeah, and that flows right down. Operating profit up 25% in DKK and a, frankly, remarkable 29% at CER. That hit DKK 72.2 billion. Net profit climbed significantly too, 22% to DKK 55.5 billion. And diluted earnings per share up 23% to DKK 12.49.
So, really solid growth across the board. Impressive. But is that growth happening everywhere equally, or are some regions doing the heavy lifting?
That's a key point. The regional details and actually one specific financial adjustment give us a much clearer idea of where the growth is really coming from, particularly the U.S. market, which is always, complex. U.S. operations saw sales up 16% in DKK, 17% at CER. But here's the kicker. There was a positive DKK 3 billion gross to net sales adjustment.
Gross to net. What does that mean exactly?
Right, so it's related to the 340B provision from previous years, and they booked it in Q2 2025. Basically, it's like they previously estimated they'd owe more discounts under this program for certain hospitals and clinics, and now they've adjusted that estimate down. It's a financial true-up boosting this quarter's numbers, not purely new sales growth, if that makes sense.
Got it. So a bit of a one-off boost in the U.S. figures. What about internationally?
International operations kept pace nicely. Sales up 16% in DKK and 19% at CER. So both big segments are contributing, but yeah, those U.S. numbers have that important footnote.
That U.S. adjustment definitely adds a layer. But the real engine, where the story gets, well, really compelling, is in their therapeutic areas. How are they managing that dynamic between the booming obesity market and their established GLP-1 diabetes drugs?
Oh, the diabetes and obesity care segment is, without a doubt, the powerhouse. Total sales grew 16% DKK, 18% CER, hitting DKK 145.4 billion. And within that, obesity care is just exploding. Sales there surged by a massive 56% in DKK, 58% CER. That's DKK 38.8 billion. Just incredible acceleration.
And I assume that's mostly Wegovy, right? That name is everywhere.
Absolutely. Wegovy sales just soared. 75% increase in DKK, 78% at CER. That's DKK 36.888 billion. And they've rolled it out pretty widely now, too, around 35 countries in their international operations. On the flip side, you see Saxenda sales dropping sharply, down 51% in DKK. It's a really clear signal the market's shifting fast to those once-weekly shots. Like Wegovy, convenience is king, it seems.
Makes sense. What about the U.S. obesity market specifically? We hear so much about the demand, the shortages.
Yeah, in the U.S., obesity sales grew a strong 36% at CER. They're seeing about 280,000 weekly prescriptions for Wegovy. But, and this is where that tug of war comes in, the volume of compounded GLP-1s is a real issue.
Compounded, meaning?
Meaning pharmacies, often compounding pharmacies, are making their own versions of the active ingredient, semaglutide. Novo Nordisk estimates this has really hit Wegovy's uptake and the growth of the official branded market. They're quite concerned, calling it unsafe and unlawful mass compounding. They're pursuing lawsuits, even though the FDA's sort of grace period on this ended back in May.
So they're fighting that on one hand, but also trying to make legitimate access easier.
Exactly. It's the two-pronged approach. They launched NovoCare Pharmacy back in March 2025.
Ah, the direct-to-patient one.
That's the one. It's doing about 10,000 weekly prescriptions now. Plus, there's another 17,000 in what they call the retail cash channel. They're also working with telehealth companies to get people access more smoothly. And a really big win for them. From July 1st, Wegovy became the only GLP-1 covered for obesity on the main CVS national formulary. That's huge for insurance coverage.
Okay, massive. Now, shifting gears slightly to the diabetes side of their GLP-1 story, how are those sales looking? Still strong.
Still solid, yeah.
Yeah.
GLP-1 diabetes sales grew 8% in DKK, 10% CER, reaching DKK 77.9 billion. Ozempic is still the main driver there. Sales up 14% DKK, 15% CER, driven by both the US and internationally. Rybelsus, their oral GLP-1, was up 4% DKK, 5% TER. Interesting, their international growth's kind of balanced out declines in the US, but just like Saxenda, Victoza, the older daily GLP-1, saw sales drop sharply down 53% DKK. Again, that clear shift to once weekly.
And their overall slice of the GLP-1 diabetes market is competition, like Eli Lilly's Mounjaro making a dent.
Their global GLP-1 diabetes market share is now 51.9%. That is down a bit from 56.1% a year ago. But there's a nuance here with how data gets reported. Competitor drugs like tirzepatide, Mounjaro, right? In IQVIA data, it's apparently only categorized as a diabetes treatment in international markets, even though it has obesity indications. So that might, subtly skew how these market share numbers look. Could be masking some of the competitive heat, particularly in obesity.
Interesting point on the data. And what about insulin? It's still a big part of their business.
It is, but slower growth. Insulin sales increased 3% DKK, 4% CER to DKK 27.7 billion. Their global insulin market share did dip slightly, though, from 44.9% down to 43.3%.
You know what these detailed sales figures really hammer home, especially looking at Saxenda and Victoza falling off while Wegovy and Ozempic climb, is just how fast patient preference is changing. People are clearly choosing convenience.
Absolutely. It's a fundamental shift. And it underlines that even a giant like Novo Nordisk is in this constant battle. They're driving innovation, but also facing intense competition. That compounding issue in the US, for example, even with Wegovy prescriptions rising, shows just how complex the access and supply situation is for these obesity treatments. There's huge need, but getting the drug to patients isn't simple.
Right. And in diabetes, Ozempic is still strong, but that slight market share dip does suggest competitors are definitely making inroads, even if data quirks muddy the waters a bit.
Exactly. It's a super dynamic space.
So given all that competition and dynamism, it brings us straight to innovation. They're obviously not just sitting back counting the money, are they? Their R&D pipeline seems like a real glimpse into where they think healthcare is heading. What's cooking in the labs?
You're right. They are investing heavily in what's next. The obesity pipeline is particularly active. Amycretin, which they have in both injectable and oral forms, is moving into phase 3 for weight management. That's a big step. Trials should start early 2026. They got positive signals from regulators.
Amycretin. Okay. What else?
Then there's CagriSema. That's a fixed-dose combo of cagrilintide and semaglutide. They've started a big phase 3B trial called Redefine 11 for obesity. It's an 80-week trial, plus another 80 weeks to see how well it maintains weight loss. They've also finished phase 1 for a version where both drugs are in a single chamber pen. And they're pushing for a higher dose of Wegovy in Europe, 7.2 milligrams, up from the current 2.4 milligrams max.
So lots moving forward there, but R&D involves tough choices too, right? Did anything get dropped?
Yes, that's always part of the process. They did stop development on a different once-weekly GLP-1 GIP coagonist, and also on INB 347, which was an oral small molecule trying a different mechanism, a CB1 receptor blocker. The reasons given were things like portfolio considerations or issues with the drug's profile, its pharmacokinetics. It shows they're focusing resources on the most promising shots.
Okay. What about innovation in diabetes beyond the big GLP-1s or other areas they're exploring?
Well, Ozempic itself got a boost. It received a positive opinion in Europe for new use, treating peripheral arterial disease, PAD, in people with type 2 diabetes. That's pretty significant, moving beyond just blood sugar. The data from the STRIDE trial showed it improved walking distance and cut disease progression substantially.
Expanding the use of existing blockbusters. Smart. And other areas. Cardiovascular?
Yes, they're pushing into cardiovascular and related areas. Semaglutide, the molecule in Ozempic and Wegovy, is up for approval for MASH, that's the liver disease, sometimes called fatty liver disease. It's submitted in Japan and the US, where it actually got priority review. Approval expected soon, Q3 2025. But they also had a setback in MSH. Development of another drug, Zalfermin, was stopped after phase 2 because it didn't meet its main goal. Same for a potential dyslipidemia drug, ANGPTL3I, stopped after phase 1.
Okay, so wins and losses, which is typical. Anything else in the cardiovascular or rare disease space?
In rare disease, Alhemo, which is concizumab, got approved in the US in July for hemophilia A and B patients without inhibitors. And it got a positive nod in the EU too. That's a key milestone for their rare blood disorder franchise. Also, Sogroya, their long-acting growth hormone, has new potential uses for kids born small for gestational age. Noonan syndrome, idiopathic short stature, submitted for approval in the U.S. and Japan.
Right, right.
And back to cardiovascular. For ATTR cardiomyopathy, a rare heart condition, their drug Cormitug, or PRX004, finished phase 2 successfully. Phase 3 should start this year. For heart failure, it's a bit mixed. A phase 2 trial for a drug called CDR132L failed for acute heart attack patients with reduced heart function. So no go there. But they haven't given up on the molecule. They started 2 new phase 2 trials for CDR132L, this time in chronic heart failure patients. Looking at both types preserved and reduced ejection fraction shows they're adapting.
Adapting is key. Any new mechanisms entirely.
Yeah, one really interesting one. They've started a phase 1 trial for an oral NLRP3 inhibitor, NN67005. NLRP3 is involved in inflammation. The hope is this could work across a whole range of conditions: liver, kidney, cardiometabolic diseases. It's early days, but it represents a totally new approach for them.
Fascinating. And any big deals or partnerships that signal their strategy?
Yes, a very notable one. They struck an exclusive global deal with Septerna Inc. This is focused on developing oral, small molecule drugs targeting GPCRs. Those are key cell surface receptors. Specifically, they're going after the receptors for GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon, aiming for new treatments for obesity, type 2 diabetes, and other cardiometabolic issues. The potential value is huge, up to $2.2 billion US, with over $200 million upfront and near term. It's a clear sign they're serious about building a strong oral pipeline beyond injectables.
Looking at all this R&D activity, the wins, the setbacks, the partnerships, it really paints a picture of a company not just riding the wave, but actively trying to shape the next wave, even if it means cutting some promising-looking things early on.
That's exactly it. It shows a clear long-term vision. They're willing to place multiple bets, explore different mechanisms, partner strategically, and importantly, adapt when the science doesn't pan out for one indication but might for another, like with CDR132L. It's about building resilience for the future.
Right. So beyond the financials and the pipeline, what about their bigger picture goals? Things like ESG, environment, social, governance. How are they tracking there?
Well, the report covers this, and it does highlight some of the, shall we say, growing pains of rapid expansion. On the environmental side, their overall CO2 equivalent emissions actually went up by 31% compared to the first half of 2024.
Up 31%. Wow, why such a big jump?
It breaks down across the scopes. Scope 1, their direct emissions up 61%. That's mainly from new production sites coming online and using more natural gas. Scope 2, indirect emissions from electricity, soared 220%. That big Scope 2 jump is mostly due to using non-renewable electricity at the sites they just acquired, primarily from the Catalent deal. It actually pulled their overall share of renewable electricity for production down to 86% from 100% previously.
So buying growth impacted their green credentials, at least temporarily.
Exactly. And Scope 3, their value chain emissions were up 28%, driven by raw material supply and just building out all this new capacity, the capital expenditure.
Okay, so definite environmental challenges with scaling up. What about things like plastic use?
The story is a bit more nuanced. Their absolute plastic footprint did rise by 5%, but interestingly, the relative footprint, so plastic per patient treated, actually decreased by 3%. That's largely driven by that shift we talked about, moving from daily injections like Saxenda or Victoza to once-weekly ones like Wegovy or Ozempic, which obviously uses less plastic per patient over a given period.
Okay, that makes sense. And on the S and ESG, the social side, patient reach, employees?
They report reaching a total of 45.7 million people with their diabetes and obesity drugs. That's up 3.6 million since June 2024. Most are diabetes patients, 42.8 million, with 2.9 million on obesity care. However, they did see a 13% decline in the number of vulnerable patients treated with their diabetes products, down to 7.5 million. They attribute this to fewer sales through tenders, like government contracts and consolidating their older human insulin lines.
A decline in vulnerable patients. That's notable. Any positive social programs?
Their Changing Diabetes in Children program is growing. It reached nearly 73,000 kids, up 28%, aiming for 100,000 by 2030. And employee-wise, their headcount jumped 13% to over 78,000. About 3,000 of those came from the Catalent acquisition. They also nudged up the percentage of women in senior leadership roles to 43% from 41%. Progress there.
Okay. And then G for governance. There's been some pretty big news on the leadership front, hasn't there?
Yes, quite a shakeup at the very top. Lars Fruergaard Jørgensen is stepping down as CEO after 8 years. His successor, effective August 7th, is Maziar Mike Daustar, who was previously heading up international operations.
Big change. Any other key moves?
Yeah, they're consolidating their R&D structure, Research and early development and the later stage development group are merging under Martin Holst-Lange, who becomes the chief scientific officer. That also takes effect August 7th. Emil Kongsjord Larsen steps into Mike Daustar's old role leading international operations. And one more interesting addition. Dr. Michael Dolston, who used to be the chief scientific officer at Pfizer, has joined Novo's board as an observer. That clearly brings in heavyweight R&D and strategic experience.
So new CEO, consolidated R&D leadership, new international head, and bringing in external scientific expertise at the board level. That sounds like a very deliberate reshaping for the future.
It really does. It connects back to everything else. They're facing growth challenges, like the CO2 emissions from acquisitions. They're navigating intense competition and the need for constant innovation. These leadership changes seem designed to position them to tackle exactly those things head-on.
It's fascinating how the ESG and governance pieces really tie into the bigger operational and strategic picture. It's not just a separate report card.
Got it all. It shows the interconnectedness, growth impacts environment, acquisitions impact workforce and diversity stats, market pressures likely influence leadership changes and R&D structure. It's all part of the same complex organism.
Okay, so we've talked about strong H1 numbers, a dynamic pipeline, ESG considerations, leadership changes, but here's the real twist, isn't it? Despite that strong first half, they've actually lowered their forecast for the full year. That feels counterintuitive. What's driving that caution?
That is the big headline coming out of this report in many ways. They've definitely dialed back expectations significantly. Sales growth for the full year is now pegged at 8.14% at CER. That's down quite a bit from the 13.21% they guided previously. Same story for operating profit growth, now 10.16% at CER, down from 16.24%. And they also noted that the reported growth in Danish kroner will likely be lower than CER figures by about 3 percentage points for sales and 5 for operating profit, mostly because the US dollar has weakened against the krone.
That's a pretty substantial downgrade. What are the main reasons they're pointing to for this more cautious second half?
They laid out a few key factors. One is the persistent and apparently increasing use of those compounded GLP-1s we discussed. That's clearly eating into their branded sales more than perhaps anticipated. They also mentioned slower than expected overall market expansion. Maybe the market isn't growing quite as fast as everyone thought it would. And third, just increased competition across the board. Specifically, they called out lower growth expectations now for Wegovy in the U.S. obesity market, for Ozempic in the U.S. diabetes market, and also for Wegovy in some international markets. So pressure on their biggest products in their biggest markets.
So compounding slower market growth and competition hitting their star performers. Are these lowered expectations causing them to pull back on their huge expansion plans? Or are they still full steam ahead on billing capacity?
They are absolutely sticking to the investment plan. Capital expenditure spending on factories, equipment, property is still expected to be around DKK 65 billion for the year. That signals they are committed to massively expanding their global supply chain, especially for the active ingredients, the API, and the fill-finish capacity, which is bottling and packaging. They're playing the long game there.
Okay, so the building continues, but what about cash flow?
That's where the revised outlook bites. Free cash flow expectations are down. They now expect DKK 35.45 million, whereas before they were guiding DKK 56.66 billion. That reduction directly reflects the lower sales growth outlook, especially for the GLP-1s in the U.S. And the impact gets amplified by the U.S. gross-to-net system, the gap between the list price and the actual net price they receive after rebates and discounts. Lower gross sales mean even lower net cash flow.
Right. So even though that first half looked really strong on the surface, this revised outlook, driven by things like compounding and competition, shows that even a company riding a huge wave like Novo Nordisk is facing some serious headwinds.
It absolutely does. It's a reality check. Explosive growth in one area doesn't make you immune to market forces or competitive pressure. Those massive investments in production and R&D are crucial for the future, no doubt. But they also require enormous amounts of cash, and that becomes tougher when near-term revenue forecasts get trimmed, especially in high-margin markets like the U.S. It really underscores the need for constant strategic agility.
So, what does this all mean for you, listening? This deep dive into Novo Nordisk's half-year really shows a company in, well, that fascinating tug-of-war we mentioned at the start. Incredible growth, yes, absolutely historic in some ways. But on the other side, real market pressures competition, the compounding issue, maybe a slightly cooling market overall. And layered on top is this very deliberate long-term strategy. Huge investments, pipeline bets, leadership changes. It gives you a lot to think about, doesn't it? Especially regarding the future of global health and the pharma industry. Here's maybe the final thought to chew on. Will these massive bets on future capacity and diversifying their pipeline actually pay off? Can they sustain this momentum and navigate these headwinds, especially as the whole GLP-1 landscape just keeps getting more crowded and complex? That's well, maybe the multi-billion-dollar question for Novo Nordisk and honestly for the future of treating chronic diseases worldwide.